The letter trembled in Julia Palmer's hands as she stood on the dusty main street of Clifton Hill, Missouri, watching the stagecoach that carried her children disappear into the western horizon, and she knew with every fiber of her being that she would do whatever it took to bring them home. The September afternoon in 1878 was unseasonably warm, and sweat mixed with tears on her cheeks as the reality of what had just happened crashed over her like a wave. Her husband had been dead only 3 months, killed in a mining accident outside of town, and now his family had swooped in like vultures to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Her 2 children, 8-year-old Samuel and 6-year-old Mary, had been taken while she was working at the general store, and the only thing left behind was a legal document claiming she was an unfit mother due to her poverty and lack of proper family connections. The injustice of it burned in her chest. She had loved Thomas Palmer with all her heart, and they had built a good life together despite his family's disapproval of their marriage. The Palmers were wealthy landowners with cattle ranches spanning 3 counties, and they had never forgiven Thomas for marrying a woman they considered beneath their station. Julia's own parents had died of influenza when she was 17, leaving her to work as a seamstress until she met Thomas at a church social. He had been different from his family, kind and gentle, seeing her for who she was rather than what she lacked. But now he was gone, and his family had shown their true colors. She clutched the letter tighter, reading it again though the words made her stomach turn. The Palmers had filed paperwork with a judge in Kansas City, claiming that Julia could not provide adequate care for the children, and that they, as prominent members of society with means and resources, were better suited to raise Thomas's heirs. The document stated that she had 10 days to contest the ruling, but Julia had no money for a lawyer, no connections to anyone who might help her navigate the complex legal system, and no idea where to even begin. The sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk made her look up. A tall man in dusty riding clothes was approaching, his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. She had seen him around town for the past few weeks, always polite when he came into the general store for supplies, but they had never exchanged more than basic pleasantries. His name was Yates Yarbrough, and he worked as a ranch hand at the Morrison spread just outside of town. He was probably in his late 20s, with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was something steady about him, something that made people trust him instinctively. "Mrs. Palmer," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep and calm. "I heard what happened. I am sorry for your trouble." Julia tried to compose herself, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Yarbrough. I appreciate your kindness." He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I do not mean to intrude, but I could not help overhearing some of the talk in town. The Palmers took your children." The words made it real again, and Julia felt her composure crumbling. "They have papers from a judge. They say I cannot care for Samuel and Mary properly, they say." Her voice broke. "They say the children belong with family who can provide for them." Yates's jaw tightened. "That does not sound right. You are their mother." "The law does not seem to care about that," Julia said bitterly. "I have 10 days to contest it, but I do not have money for a lawyer or anyone who knows how to fight something like this. The Palmers have wealth and influence. I have nothing." She expected him to offer sympathy and move on, as most people did when confronted with problems too large to solve. Instead, Yates took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, thinking, "I might know someone who can help. There is a lawyer in Jefferson City named Marcus Brennan. He has a reputation for taking on cases that others would not touch, especially when there is injustice involved." Julia shook her head. "I cannot afford a lawyer, Mr. Yarbrough. I can barely afford to keep a roof over my head as it is." "Let me talk to him first," Yates said. "Brennan owes me a favor from years back. I helped his brother out of some trouble in Texas. Maybe he would be willing to work something out." Hope flickered in Julia's chest, fragile and terrifying. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Yates met her eyes, and she saw something fierce and honest there. "Because what they did is wrong. Because no mother should have her children stolen from her. And because—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because I know what it is like to be powerless against people who think they can do whatever they want because they have money and position. I may not be able to do much, but if I can help you, I will." The sincerity in his voice made Julia's throat tighten with emotion. She had felt so alone since Thomas died, drowning in grief and struggling to keep her head above water. The idea that someone would extend a hand to help, expecting nothing in return, was almost too much to believe. "I would be forever grateful," she managed to say. "My children are everything to me, Mr. Yarbrough. I will do whatever it takes to get them back." "Call me Yates," he said, putting his hat back on. "And we will get them back, Mrs. Palmer. I promise you that." The next morning, Yates rode out before dawn, heading east toward Jefferson City. Julia went to work at the general store as usual, though her mind was 1,000 miles away. The store owner, Mrs. Henderson, was a kind woman who had heard about the situation and offered Julia as much sympathy as she could. But sympathy would not bring her children home. Julia moved through the day in a fog, measuring out flour and sugar, wrapping parcels, making change, all while her heart ached with the absence of Samuel and Mary. She kept seeing their faces, confused and frightened, as they were hustled into the stagecoach by Thomas's older brother, Gerald Palmer, and his stern-faced wife, Constance. 3 days passed with no word from Yates. Julia tried not to let despair overwhelm her, but each day that passed was one day less to contest the ruling. She lay awake at night in the small house she had shared with Thomas, listening to the silence where her children's breathing should have been. The emptiness was suffocating. On the 4th day, Yates returned. Julia saw him riding down Main Street just as she was closing up the store, and she rushed outside, her heart pounding. "He will take the case," Yates said as he dismounted. His face was tired from hard riding, but there was satisfaction in his eyes. "Brennan says what the Palmers did is legally questionable at best. They should not have been able to get a ruling without you being present or properly notified. He thinks we have a strong case, but we need to act fast." "What do we need to do?" Julia asked, hardly daring to believe it. "We need to file a counterclaim and get a hearing scheduled as soon as possible. Brennan is drawing up the papers now, but he needs you to come to Jefferson City to sign them and give a statement. He also wants to gather evidence of your character and your ability to care for your children. Letters from people in town who can vouch for you, evidence of your employment and stability, anything that shows you are a good mother." Julia nodded quickly. "Mrs. Henderson will write a letter, and Reverend Thomas from the church. He knows me well." "Good. Can you get away from work for a few days? Brennan wants to meet with you as soon as possible." "I will ask Mrs. Henderson. I am sure she will understand." Yates hesitated, then said, "I am coming with you. The ride to Jefferson City is not easy, and you should not make it alone." Something in Julia's chest warmed at his protectiveness. "You have already done so much. I do not want to impose on you further." "It is not an imposition," Yates said firmly. "We are going to see this through together." That night, Julia went to see Mrs. Henderson, who not only agreed to write a glowing letter of recommendation, but also gave Julia a week off with pay, insisting that she take care of what mattered most. Reverend Thomas was equally supportive, promising to write a detailed account of Julia's character and her devotion to her children. By the time Julia returned home, she had gathered 3 strong letters and a handful of testimonials from neighbors who had watched her care for Samuel and Mary with love and dedication. The next morning, Julia and Yates set out for Jefferson City on horseback. Yates had borrowed a gentle mare for Julia from the Morrison Ranch, and they rode through the Missouri countryside as the late September sun rose over rolling hills and scattered farms. At first, they rode in silence, but as the miles passed, they began to talk. "You said you knew what it was like to be powerless," Julia said as they stopped to water the horses at a creek. "What did you mean?" Yates was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the water. "My father was a sharecropper in Tennessee. We worked land owned by a man named Horace Caldwell, who thought he could do whatever he wanted because he had money and we did not. When I was 16, Caldwell tried to cheat my father out of his share of the harvest. My father stood up to him, and Caldwell had him beaten so badly he never fully recovered. He died 2 years later, broken in body and spirit." Julia felt a pang of sympathy. "That is terrible. I am so sorry." "I swore then that I would never let people like that win, not if I could help it," Yates said. "I left Tennessee and came west to make my own way. I have worked hard to build something honest, and when I see people using their power to hurt others, it makes me want to fight back." "You are a good man, Yates Yarbrough," Julia said softly. He looked at her then, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, something warm and unexpected. "You are stronger than you know, Julia Palmer. Anyone who can face what you are facing and still keep going has more courage than most people will ever have." The use of her first name sent a small thrill through her, though she told herself it was only natural given the circumstances. They were working together toward a common goal, and formality seemed unnecessary. Still, there was something about the way he said her name that made her feel seen, truly seen for the first time since Thomas had died. They reached Jefferson City by late afternoon the following day. The city was larger and more bustling than Clifton Hill, with brick buildings and paved streets crowded with wagons and pedestrians. Yates led them to a modest office building near the courthouse, where Marcus Brennan had his practice. The lawyer was a man in his 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Yates warmly, shaking his hand and clapping him on the shoulder. "Yates Yarbrough, as I live and breathe. It has been too long, my friend." "It has, Marcus. I appreciate you taking this case." "Any friend of yours is a friend of mine," Brennan said, then turned to Julia with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Palmer, I am honored to meet you. Yates has told me about your situation, and I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to help you get your children back." Julia felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. I cannot tell you what this means to me." They spent the next several hours going over every detail of Julia's life with Thomas, her relationship with his family, and the circumstances surrounding the children being taken. Brennan took careful notes, asking pointed questions and nodding thoughtfully as Julia answered. When she presented the letters from Mrs. Henderson and Reverend Thomas, along with the testimonials from her neighbors, Brennan smiled with satisfaction. "This is excellent," he said. "These letters paint a clear picture of you as a devoted mother and a hardworking, upstanding citizen. The Palmers are going to have a difficult time arguing that you are unfit when you have such strong support from your community." "What are our chances?" Julia asked, afraid to hope too much. "Better than you might think," Brennan said. "The process the Palmers used to obtain custody was highly irregular. They filed in Kansas City rather than in your local jurisdiction, which suggests they were trying to avoid scrutiny. They also failed to properly notify you of the hearing, which is a violation of your rights. A good judge will see through their tactics. However, we need to be prepared for them to fight back. The Palmers have money and influence, and they will use every tool at their disposal. What do we do now? Yates asked. I have already filed the counterclaim and requested an emergency hearing. We should have a date within the next few days. In the meantime, I need you both to stay in Jefferson City. We may need to gather additional evidence or respond to motions from the Palmers' lawyers. Julia nodded, though the thought of staying away from Clifton Hill while her children were even further away made her heart ache. Yates seemed to sense her distress and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We will get through this, he said quietly. They found lodgings at a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, who rented them separate rooms on the second floor. That evening, Julia sat by the window in her small room, watching the city lights flicker in the growing darkness. She thought of Samuel and Mary, wondering where they were and if they were frightened. The Palmers lived on a sprawling ranch outside of Kansas City, and while Julia knew they would provide materially for the children, she also knew that material comfort was not the same as love. Thomas had often spoken of his childhood, of how cold and distant his parents had been, more concerned with social standing than with nurturing their children's hearts. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Yates stood in the hallway, holding 2 plates of food. I thought you might not have eaten, he said. Mrs. Calloway made stew, and I brought you some. Julia realized she was indeed hungry, having been too nervous to eat much all day. That is very thoughtful, thank you. They sat together in her room, the door left open for propriety's sake, and ate in companionable silence. After a while, Yates said, Tell me about your children. What are they like? Julia smiled, the first real smile she had felt in days. Samuel is bright and curious. He loves to read and is always asking questions about how things work. Thomas used to say he would make a fine engineer someday. And Mary is sweet and gentle, always caring for injured birds or stray kittens. She has the kindest heart of anyone I have ever known. They sound wonderful, Yates said. They are lucky to have you as a mother. I am the lucky one, Julia said. They give my life meaning. Without them, I do not know what I would do. Yates set down his plate and leaned forward, his expression serious. You are going to get them back, Julia. I know it feels impossible right now, but Marcus is a good lawyer and the law is on your side. You just have to hold on a little longer. Why are you doing this? Julia asked suddenly. You could have walked away at any time. You do not owe me anything. Yates was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. At first, I helped because it was the right thing to do. But the more I have gotten to know you, the more I have come to admire your strength and your love for your children. You deserve to have them back, and I want to be part of making that happen. There was something more in his eyes, something that made Julia's breath catch. She had been so consumed with grief and worry that she had not allowed herself to notice how kind Yates was, how steady and reliable. But now, sitting across from him in the lamplight, she saw him clearly, and a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the food or the room's temperature. I am grateful to have you on my side, she said softly. The hearing was scheduled for 5 days later, and those days passed in a blur of preparation. Brennan drilled Julia on potential questions the Palmers' lawyers might ask, teaching her how to remain calm and composed even when they tried to rattle her. Yates stayed by her side through it all, offering encouragement and support. In the evenings, they would walk through the city streets, talking about their lives and their hopes for the future. Julia learned that Yates had a dream of owning his own ranch someday, a place where he could build something lasting and good. He learned that Julia had always wanted to open a small school for children in Clifton Hill, teaching them to read and write and giving them opportunities she had not had growing up. The more time they spent together, the more Julia felt herself drawn to him. It was different from what she had felt with Thomas. Thomas had been her first love, sweet and gentle, but their relationship had been born of youth and innocence. What she felt for Yates was deeper, forged in the fire of shared struggle and mutual respect. She found herself noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the steadiness of his hands, the warmth in his voice when he spoke to her. And sometimes, when he looked at her, she thought she saw the same feelings reflected back. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, with a sharp wind blowing in from the north. Julia dressed in her best dress, a simple but well-made garment of dark blue that Thomas had bought for her 2 years ago. Yates wore a clean shirt and jacket, his hair combed back, looking every inch the respectable gentleman. Brennan met them at the courthouse steps, his expression confident but serious. "Remember what we discussed," he told Julia. "Answer the questions honestly and directly. Do not let them make you angry or upset. Show the judge that you are a calm, rational, loving mother who wants only what is best for her children." The courtroom was smaller than Julia had expected, with wooden benches and a raised platform where the judge would sit. On one side of the room sat the Palmers' legal team, 3 well-dressed men with expensive leather briefcases. On the other side, Brennan set up his own modest materials, arranging papers and documents with practiced efficiency. Julia sat beside him, with Yates directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like an anchor. When the Palmers themselves entered, Julia's stomach clenched. Gerald Palmer was a tall, imposing man in his 50s with silver hair and a cold, calculating gaze. His wife, Constance, was equally austere, her face set in lines of disapproval. They did not look at Julia, treating her as if she were beneath their notice. Behind them came an older couple, Thomas's parents, Nathaniel and Beatrice Palmer. Julia had met them only a handful of times, and each encounter had been marked by their barely concealed disdain for her. Seeing them now, knowing they were complicit in taking her children, made her blood boil. The judge entered, a stern-looking man in his 60s named Judge Cornelius Hayes. Everyone stood as he took his seat, and then the hearing began. The Palmers' lawyer, a slick man named Whitmore, spoke first, laying out their case with smooth confidence. He painted a picture of Julia as a poor, struggling widow who could not provide the stability and opportunities that the Palmer family could offer. He emphasized the family's wealth, their social standing, and their ability to give Samuel and Mary the best education and upbringing money could buy. He made it sound as if Julia's love for her children was irrelevant compared to the material advantages the Palmers could provide. When it was Brennan's turn, he stood slowly, radiating a quiet authority that commanded attention. He began by addressing the procedural irregularities in how the Palmers had obtained custody, pointing out that they had deliberately bypassed the local court in Clifton Hill and failed to properly notify Julia of the hearing. He then systematically dismantled the argument that wealth equated to fitness as a parent, presenting the letters and testimonials that showed Julia to be a woman of excellent character, beloved by her community, and deeply devoted to her children. "Your Honor," Brennan said, his voice ringing through the courtroom, "the law does not say that children should go to the wealthiest relatives. It says that children should be with the parent who can best care for them, who loves them, and who will nurture them into good and decent human beings. Mrs. Palmer has demonstrated time and again that she is exactly that kind of parent. She works hard to provide for her children. She is active in her church and her community. She has raised two healthy, happy children who are thriving under her care. The Palmers may have money, but they do not have what matters most, a mother's love. Julia felt tears streaming down her face as Brennan spoke, and she did not bother to wipe them away. Behind her, she heard Yates shift in his seat, and she felt his hand briefly touch her shoulder in support. The judge called Julia to the stand, and she walked forward on shaking legs. Whitmore questioned her first, trying to make her appear incompetent and irresponsible. He asked about her finances, her work schedule, her ability to supervise her children. Julia answered each question calmly and honestly, just as Brennan had taught her. She did not try to hide her struggles, but she also made it clear that she had always put her children first, always made sure they were fed and clothed and loved. When Brennan questioned her, he asked her to describe her relationship with Samuel and Mary. Julia spoke from the heart, telling stories of reading to them at night, of teaching Mary to sew and helping Samuel with his schoolwork, of the laughter and joy that filled their small house. She spoke of Thomas and how much he had loved their children, and how she was determined to honor his memory by raising them to be kind, compassionate people. "Mrs. Palmer," Brennan said gently, "what would it mean to you to have your children back?" Julia looked directly at the judge as she answered, "It would mean everything, Your Honor. My children are my whole world. I know I cannot give them fancy clothes or a big house, but I can give them love and guidance and a home where they are cherished. That is what children need most, and that is what I can provide." The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even Whitmore seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The judge called a recess to consider the evidence, and Julia returned to her seat, feeling drained but hopeful. Yates leaned forward and whispered, "You did beautifully. I am so proud of you." The warmth in his voice made Julia's heart swell. She turned to look at him, and their eyes met for a long moment. In that look, she saw everything she had been feeling reflected back at her. The growing affection, the admiration, the connection that had formed between them over the past days and weeks. It was not the time or place to speak of such things, but the acknowledgement was there, unspoken but real. After what felt like an eternity, the judge returned. Everyone stood as he took his seat again, and Julia held her breath, her entire future hanging in the balance. "I have reviewed the evidence and testimony presented here today," Judge Hayes said, his voice grave. "It is clear to me that the process by which the Palmer family obtained custody of Samuel and Mary Palmer was deeply flawed. Mrs. Palmer was not properly notified of the initial hearing, which is a fundamental violation of her rights as a parent. Furthermore, I find the argument that wealth alone makes one a better parent to be without merit. The law recognizes that a parent's fitness is determined by many factors, including character, stability, and love for the child." He paused, and Julia felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "It is the judgment of this court that custody of Samuel and Mary Palmer be immediately returned to their mother, Julia Palmer. The children shall be released from the Palmer family's custody within 24 hours. Furthermore, I am ordering that the Palmer family cover all legal costs associated with this hearing, as their actions were both improper and harmful to the children's mother." Julia felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath her. Joy flooded through her so intensely that she could barely breathe. Behind her, she heard Yates let out a breath of relief, and Brennan was smiling broadly, shaking her hand and congratulating her. Across the room, the Palmers looked furious, Whitmore already gathering his papers with jerky, angry movements. "Thank you," Julia whispered to Brennan, then turned to Yates. Thank you so much." Yates pulled her into a brief, fierce hug, right there in the courtroom, propriety forgotten in the moment of triumph. "You did this," he said. "You fought for your children and you won." The next day, Julia and Yates, accompanied by Brennan and a local marshal, traveled to the Palmer Ranch outside Kansas City to retrieve the children. The ranch was as grand as Julia had imagined, with a sprawling house and manicured grounds that spoke of wealth and privilege. Gerald Palmer met them at the door, his face twisted with barely suppressed rage, but he had no choice but to comply with the court order. When Samuel and Mary came running out of the house, Julia dropped to her knees and opened her arms. Her children crashed into her, both of them crying and clinging to her as if they would never let go. "Mama, Mama," Mary sobbed. "We missed you so much." "I knew you would come for us," Samuel said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I told Mary you would find a way." Julia held them tight, tears streaming down her face, feeling as if her heart might burst with love and relief. "I am here, my darlings. I am here, and I am never letting you go again." She looked up and saw Yates watching them, his expression soft and full of emotion. In that moment, she knew that whatever happened next, she wanted him to be part of their lives. He had given her back her children, but more than that, he had shown her that there were still good people in the world, people who would stand up and fight for what was right. The journey back to Clifton Hill took 2 days, and it was the happiest 2 days Julia could remember since Thomas's death. Samuel and Mary chattered nonstop, telling her about their time at the ranch and how much they had hated being away from her. Yates rode alongside them, answering Samuel's endless questions about horses and ranching, and making Mary laugh with silly stories. Julia watched him interact with her children and saw how natural he was with them, how patient and kind. On the second evening, after the children had fallen asleep in the boarding house where they stopped for the night, Julia and Yates sat together on the porch, looking up at the stars. "I do not know how to thank you," Julia said quietly. "You gave me my life back." "You did the fighting," Yates said. "I just helped open the door." Julia turned to look at him, gathering her courage. "Yates, these past weeks, getting to know you, I have felt something I did not think I would feel again after Thomas died. You have been so kind to me and to my children, and I find myself thinking about you all the time. I know it might be too soon, and I understand if you do not feel the same way, but I wanted you to know." Yates reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and gentle. "Julia, I have been half in love with you since the day I saw you standing on Main Street with that letter in your hands, looking like you were ready to fight the whole world for your children. The more I have gotten to know you, the more certain I have become. You are strong and brave and beautiful, and I would be honored if you would let me be part of your life." Julia felt tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of joy. "I would like that very much." Yates leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wished, but Julia met him halfway. Their lips touched in a gentle, sweet kiss that spoke of new beginnings and hope for the future. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. They returned to Clifton Hill the next day, and the whole town turned out to welcome them home. Mrs. Henderson hugged Julia and cried happy tears. Reverend Thomas blessed the children and thanked God for their safe return. The neighbors brought food and gifts, celebrating the reunion. Julia's small house felt full and warm and alive again, exactly as it should be. Over the following weeks, Yates became a regular presence in their lives. He would stop by after work to help Samuel with his schoolwork or to bring Mary wildflowers he had picked on the range. He fixed the broken step on the front porch and repaired the leaky roof that Julia had been unable to afford to have fixed. He never pushed for more than Julia was ready to give, always respectful of her grief for Thomas and her need to take things slowly. But as autumn turned to winter and the first snows fell on Clifton Hill, Julia found herself falling more deeply in love with Yates every day. He was steady and reliable, always there when she needed him, but he also made her laugh and reminded her that life could be joyful again. Samuel and Mary adored him, and Julia could see that Yates loved them too, not as a duty but as a genuine affection that grew stronger with each passing day. On Christmas Eve, after the children had gone to bed, Yates arrived at the door with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Julia invited him in, and they sat by the fire, the house warm and cozy against the winter cold. "I have something for you," Yates said, handing her the package. Julia unwrapped it carefully and found a beautiful wooden box inside. When she opened it, she gasped. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a chain. "Open it," Yates said softly. Julia pressed the clasp, and the locket sprang open to reveal two tiny photographs, one of Samuel and one of Mary. "How did you get these?" she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I asked the photographer in town to make copies from the portrait you had taken last year. I wanted you to be able to carry them with you always, to remember that you fought for them and won." Julia could not speak. She threw her arms around Yates's neck, holding him tight. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much." Yates pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "I love you too, Julia. I have wanted to say it for weeks, but I was waiting for the right moment. Marry me. Let me be a husband to you and a father to Samuel and Mary. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." Julia did not hesitate. "Yes. Yes. 1,000 times yes." They were married in February of 1879 in a simple ceremony at the Clifton Hill Church with the whole town in attendance. Samuel and Mary stood up with them, beaming with happiness. Julia wore a new dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her make, and Yates wore his best suit, looking so handsome that Julia's heart swelled with love every time she looked at him. After the wedding, Yates moved into Julia's house, and they began building a life together. He continued working at the Morrison Ranch, saving money toward his dream of buying his own land. Julia kept working at the general store, finding joy in the routine and in serving her community. In the evenings, they would gather as a family, reading together or playing games, filling the house with laughter and warmth. The Palmers made one final attempt to interfere, sending a letter demanding that Samuel and Mary spend summers with them. Yates and Julia consulted with Marcus Brennan, who wrote a firm response stating that the court's decision was final and that any further harassment would result in legal action. After that, the Palmers disappeared from their lives, apparently deciding that the fight was not worth the trouble. As the years passed, Julia and Yates's love deepened and matured. They faced challenges, as all couples do, but they faced them together, always communicating and supporting each other. Samuel grew into a fine young man, eventually going to college to study engineering, just as his father had hoped. Mary became a teacher, opening a small school for children in Clifton Hill, fulfilling the dream that Julia had once had for herself. In the spring of 1881, Julia discovered she was expecting a child. Yates was overjoyed, and Samuel and Mary could not wait to have a baby brother or sister. In November of that year, Julia gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after Julia's first husband, a gesture that honored the past while embracing the future. Yates held his son with such tenderness that Julia fell in love with him all over again. 2 years later, they had another child, a daughter they named Rose. By that time, Yates had saved enough money to buy a small ranch of his own, and they moved into a larger house on the property. The ranch was modest but well run, and Yates threw himself into making it successful. Julia helped where she could, keeping the books and managing the household, while also continuing her work with children in the community. Samuel finished college and returned to Clifton Hill, where he started a business building bridges and other structures for the growing town. Mary married a kind schoolteacher named David, and they settled nearby, giving Julia and Yates grandchildren to dote on. Thomas and Rose grew up surrounded by love, learning to ride horses and help with the ranch work, always knowing that they were cherished. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Julia and Yates sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the Missouri sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their children were all healthy and happy, their ranch was thriving, and they were surrounded by a community that loved and respected them. "You ever think about that day on Main Street?" Yates asked, taking Julia's hand. "When you were holding that letter and I decided to help you?" Julia smiled. "I think about it often. It was the worst day of my life, but it was also the beginning of something beautiful. If the Palmers had not taken my children, I might never have truly gotten to know you. I am grateful for every day we have had together," Yates said. "You and the children are my whole world." "And you are ours," Julia said. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling completely content. "Thank you for fighting for us. Thank you for loving us." "Always," Yates promised, "for the rest of my life." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Julia thought back to the frightened, desperate woman she had been that September day in 1878. She had thought her life was over, that she had lost everything that mattered. But instead, she had found the strength to fight, and in fighting, she had found not only her children but also a love that was deeper and more enduring than anything she had imagined possible. The pain of loss had been real, and she would never forget Thomas or stop being grateful for the years they had shared. But life had given her a second chance, and she had seized it with both hands. Now, surrounded by family and love, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. The ranch prospered under Yates's careful management, and he gained a reputation throughout the county as an honest, hard-working man who treated everyone fairly. Julia became known for her charitable work, always the first to help a family in need or to organize support for someone facing hard times. Together, they built a legacy of kindness and integrity that would be remembered long after they were gone. Samuel's engineering business grew, and he eventually designed and built a new bridge over the Missouri River that became a point of pride for the entire region. Mary's school expanded, and she became known as one of the finest teachers in the state, shaping young minds with the same love and dedication her mother had shown her. Thomas followed in his father's footsteps, taking over the management of the ranch as Yates grew older, and Rose became a doctor, one of the first female physicians in Missouri, traveling to communities throughout the state to provide medical care. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Julia with a trip back to Jefferson City to visit Marcus Brennan. The lawyer was now in his 70s, but still sharp as a tack. He welcomed them warmly, and the three of them spent an afternoon reminiscing about the hearing that had changed all their lives. "I have handled hundreds of cases over the years," Brennan said, "but yours is one of the few that I think about often. It reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place, to fight for people who cannot fight for themselves, to stand up against injustice wherever I find it." "We owe you everything," Julia said. "You gave me back my children." "No," Brennan said gently. "You fought for your children. I just helped you navigate the system. The victory was yours." As they left Jefferson City and headed back to Clifton Hill, Julia reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying autumn of 1878. She was no longer the frightened young widow struggling to survive. She was a woman who had faced down powerful adversaries, and one who had rebuilt her life from the ashes of tragedy, who had found love again when she thought her heart was too broken to heal. And none of it would have been possible without Yates. He had been her rock, her champion, her partner in every sense of the word. He had not just saved her children. He had shown her that she was worthy of being saved, that her love and her determination mattered, that she had value beyond what society tried to assign to her based on her wealth or status. When they returned home, the entire family had gathered for a surprise party. Samuel and his wife, Mary and David, Thomas and his new bride, Rose and her beau, all of them crowded into the ranch house that had become the center of their world. There was music and laughter, food and dancing, and as Julia looked around at the faces of the people she loved most, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Yates pulled her aside during the party, leading her out to the porch where they could have a moment of privacy. "I have been thinking," he said, "about everything we have been through together, about how close we came to never finding each other." "Do not think about that," Julia said, squeezing his hand. "We did find each other. That is what matters, I know. But it makes me appreciate every single day we have even more. Julia, you have made me happier than I ever thought possible. You and our family are the greatest gift I could ever have asked for." Julia reached up and touched his face, this man who had changed her life so completely. "You saved me, Yates, not just by helping me get my children back, but by showing me that I could be happy again, that I could trust and love and build something new. You gave me hope when I had none." "We saved each other," Yates said, pulling her close, "and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." They stood there together, as the sounds of celebration drifted out from the house, holding each other and watching the Missouri sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Inside, their children and grandchildren laughed and sang, the next generation growing up with the security and love that Julia and Yates had fought so hard to create. In the years that followed, as they grew older together, Julia and Yates never forgot the struggle that had brought them together. They used their experience to help other families facing similar injustices, working with lawyers and judges to reform custody laws that gave too much power to wealth and status, instead of recognizing the fundamental bond between parent and child. Their advocacy led to changes in Missouri law that made it harder for families to use wealth and influence to take children away from loving parents. When Julia was in her 60s, she was invited to speak at a women's rights convention in St. Louis. She stood before a crowd of hundreds and told her story, speaking with passion about the importance of protecting mothers' rights and ensuring that the law recognized the value of love and devotion over material wealth. Her speech was met with thunderous applause, and several newspapers printed excerpts, spreading her message across the state. Yates was in the audience that day, watching his wife with pride and admiration. After all these years, she still had the power to take his breath away. She was older now, her dark hair threaded with silver, but to him, she was as beautiful as she had been that first day on Main Street in Clifton Hill when he had decided to help her fight for her children. As they traveled home from St. Louis, Julia leaned against Yates in the train car, feeling tired but satisfied. "Did I do all right?" she asked. "You are magnificent," Yates said. "You always are." "I could not have done any of it without you. You know that, do not you?" "We are a team," Yates said. "We always have been. Everything we have accomplished, we have done together." Julia smiled and closed her eyes, feeling the gentle rocking of the train and the warmth of her husband's presence beside her. She thought about the two frightened children who had been taken from her all those years ago, and how that desperate moment had led to a lifetime of love and purpose. She thought about how close she had come to giving up, to believing that she was powerless and alone. And she thought about the quiet cowboy who had offered to help, not for any reward or recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Life was strange and unpredictable, full of pain and loss, but also full of unexpected grace. Julia had learned that lesson the hard way, but she had learned it thoroughly. And she had spent the rest of her life trying to pass that lesson on to others, trying to be for someone else what Yates had been for her, a source of hope and strength in the darkest of times. As the years continued to pass, Yates and Julia grew old together, their love deepening with each season. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, welcomed great-grandchildren into the world, and mourned together when Samuel passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack in his 50s. Through it all, they remained each other's anchor, the steady presence that made everything else bearable. When Yates was 73, he fell ill with pneumonia. Julia nursed him through it with the same fierce determination she had shown in fighting for her children decades earlier. She sat by his bedside day and night, reading to him, talking to him, reminding him of all the reasons he had to keep fighting. And fight he did, recovering slowly but surely, until he was back on his feet and working around the ranch again. "You are not allowed to leave me," Julia told him one evening as they sat together in their favorite spot on the porch. "We made a deal, remember? We are going to grow old together." "I am not going anywhere," Yates promised. "I still have too many years to spend with you." And he kept that promise. They lived well into their 80s, still active and engaged with their family and community. The ranch was now run by Thomas and his sons, but Yates still liked to ride out and check on things, offering advice and enjoying the work that had defined so much of his life. Julia continued her advocacy work, writing letters to politicians and judges, speaking at community gatherings, always fighting for the rights of mothers and children. Even as her body grew frailer, her spirit remained strong, and she never stopped believing that the world could be made more just if people were willing to fight for it. On a warm spring evening in 1911, 33 years after they first met, Yates and Julia sat together on their porch, watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard. The ranch house was full of family. 3 generations gathered to celebrate Julia's 80th birthday. "Can you believe it has been 33 years?" Julia asked, taking Yates's hand. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Yates said. "Other times it feels like we have lived a dozen lifetimes together." "I would do it all again," Julia said. "Every moment, every struggle, every joy. I would not change a single thing." "Neither would I," Yates said. "You have been the best part of my life, Julia. You and our family. I am the luckiest man who ever lived." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the sun set over the Missouri hills. The children's laughter drifted up from the yard, a sound that never failed to make Julia smile. This was her legacy, she thought. Not just the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but the love and values they had instilled in all of them. The importance of fighting for what was right. The power of compassion and kindness. The strength that came from standing together against injustice. Inside the house, Mary was setting out the birthday cake, and Thomas was tuning his fiddle for the dancing that would follow dinner. Rose was telling stories about her latest medical adventures, making everyone laugh with her descriptions of stubborn patients and impossible situations. The house was full of life and love, exactly as it had been for the past 3 decades. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Yates stood and offered Julia his hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Yarbrough?" Julia laughed and took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. They moved slowly to music only they could hear, swaying together in the twilight. Their bodies were old and their movements were stiff, but the love between them was as strong as it had ever been. "Thank you," Julia whispered, "for everything, for fighting for me when I could not fight for myself, for loving me and my children, for building this life with me." "The pleasure has been all mine," Yates said, pulling her closer. "You have made me happier than I ever dreamed possible. I love you, Julia Yarbrough. I love you with everything I am." "And I love you," Julia said, "now and forever." They danced until the family called them inside for cake, until the fiddle music started and the real dancing began, until the house was full of joy and celebration. And as Julia looked around at the faces of everyone she loved, she knew that this was what happiness looked like. Not a life without struggle or pain, but a life where love was strong enough to overcome anything, where families stood together through good times and bad, where the bonds forged in fire proved unbreakable. Years later, when Julia and Yates had both passed on, peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, their story lived on in the family they had created. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren told the tale of how they met, of the legal battle that brought them together, of the love that had sustained them through decades of life. The story became part of the family's history, a reminder of where they came from and the values that defined them. The ranch remained in the family for generations, and the small school that Mary had founded grew into a respected institution that educated thousands of children over the years. Samuel's bridges still stood, testament to the strength and integrity he had learned from his parents. Rose's medical work paved the way for other women to enter the profession, expanding opportunities and breaking down barriers. But more than any individual achievement, Julia and Yates's true legacy was the love they had shared and the example they had set. They had shown that it was possible to face impossible odds and prevail, that justice could triumph over wealth and power when people were willing to fight for it, and that love could heal even the deepest wounds if given the chance. Their story was told and retold, passed down through the generations, a reminder that one person's decision to help, one cowboy's choice to stand up for what was right, could change everything. That in the darkest moments, when all seemed lost, hope could still be found if you were brave enough to reach for it. And so their love story became legend, a tale of courage and determination, of justice won and family reunited, of a cowboy and a widow who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a life together that would echo through the generations. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that love was worth fighting for, that family was worth protecting, and that sometimes the greatest heroes were the ordinary people who refused to stand by and let injustice prevail. In the end, Julia and Yates Yarbrough's story was more than just a romance. It was a testament to the power of the human spirit, to the strength that could be found in compassion and solidarity, to the enduring truth that when people stood together for what was right, they could move mountains. And in a world that often seemed dark and unjust, their story was a light that continued to shine, reminding everyone who heard it that hope and love would always find a way.